April 28, 1945. A muddy camp in northern France. 43 German women stepped off a military truck. Their uniforms were torn. Their faces were hollow. They had not eaten real food in weeks. They had been told one thing about Americans: they will do terrible things to captured women. Death is better than surrender. So when one woman collapsed in the mud, blood soaking through her grey dress, the others screamed. They were certain the killing had started. But the Americans didn't raise their rifles. They ran toward her with medical bags. One woman, Anneliese Vos, just 24 years old, whispered 5 words before she passed out. "I'm bleeding through my dress." What happened in the next 72 hours didn't just save her life. It destroyed everything these women had been taught to believe. They expected torture. They got penicillin. They expected starvation. They got steak, white bread, and fresh oranges. They expected monsters. They found something far more dangerous: kindness. And that kindness broke them in ways no weapon ever could. This is the true story of 43 German women prisoners and the American mercy that shattered their world. If you love real stories from history that most people have never heard, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Like this video if you want more forgotten tales from World War II. And please, watch until the end, because what these women discovered in an American prison camp will change how you think about war, enemies, and what it truly means to be human. Let's begin. The collapse that changed everything. The mud was the color of old blood. Anneliese Vos noticed it first, that thick, sucking French mud that grabbed at her worn boots as she stumbled off the canvas-covered truck into the processing yard at Camp Lucky Strike. Around her, 42 other women in stained Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms descended into the same mire, their faces gaunt, their eyes scanning for the violence they had been promised. April 28, 1945. The Reich was dying. Everyone knew it, even if no one dared say it aloud. Berlin was surrounded. The Fuhrer had retreated to his bunker. And here, in a muddy camp outside Le Havre, 43 German women, Nachrichtenhelferinnen, Stabshelferinnen, Flakwaffenhelferinnen, stood in loose formation, waiting for the Americans to reveal their true nature. The propaganda had been explicit. American soldiers are savages. They will violate you. They will torture you. Death is preferable to capture. These warnings had been drilled into them during training, reinforced by whispered stories passed between units, confirmed by official broadcasts from Berlin. Over 500,000 German women had served as military auxiliaries during the war. Those captured by the Soviets had faced horrors that matched the warnings. Surely the Americans would be no different. But what hit them first was not violence. It was smell. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the ersatz grain substitute they had choked down for years, but actual coffee. Rich and dark, wafting from somewhere beyond the processing tents. Mixed with it came the scent of frying meat, diesel fuel, and something else. Something clean. Soap. Actual soap. Anneliese inhaled deeply, and the smell made her dizzy. Or perhaps it was the pain, that grinding, tearing sensation in her lower abdomen that had been building for 3 days. She had told no one. Complaining was weakness. Weakness invited death. So she had pressed her hand against her stomach during the transport, bitten her lip until it bled, and prayed to a god she was no longer certain existed. Now standing in the mud, she felt something warm running down her inner thigh. She looked down. Her grey uniform dress was darkening at the hem. Not mud, not water, blood, fresh and red, and spreading. Anneliese, the voice belonged to Trude Fassbinder, the youngest among them at 19. Trude's eyes went wide. "Anneliese, ich blut durch mein Kleid." The words came out as a whisper. "I'm bleeding through my dress." Then her legs folded. Anneliese collapsed forward, her body hitting the mud with a wet, heavy sound that silenced every voice in the yard. For one frozen moment, nothing moved. The German women stood paralyzed. The American soldiers near the processing tents turned to look. Then the screaming began. Trude shrieked, dropping to her knees beside Anneliese. Other women scattered, certain this was the beginning, the massacre they had been promised, the violence that would now descend upon them. Waltraud Kirchner, the radio operator who still wore her party pin hidden in her pocket, grabbed 2 younger women and pulled them backward, her face twisted with fury and terror. "They've shot her." Someone screamed in German. "They've started." But no shots had been fired. What happened next defied every truth the Reich had planted in their minds. 2 American medics sprinted across the muddy yard. their boots throwing up clods of earth. They wore white armbands marked with red crosses, and their faces showed no rage, no cruelty, only urgent professional concern. Behind them came a stretcher carried by 2 more soldiers. A medical officer, Captain Vernon Holloway, according to the name stitched on his jacket, dropped his clipboard and ran, his stethoscope bouncing against his chest. Make a hole. Everyone back. The shouts were in English, but the gestures were universal. The German women parted, some still weeping, others frozen in disbelief. Trude remained crouched over Anneliese's body, shielding her friend with her own small frame, tears streaming down her mud-spattered face. "Miss, Fräulein, we need to help her." Captain Holloway's German was terrible, accented and broken, but the meaning was clear. He knelt in the mud, heedless of his uniform, and pressed 2 fingers to Anneliese's throat. Pulses weak. "Get that stretcher over here now." A medic cut away the fabric of her dress with scissors, exposing the source of the hemorrhage, an untreated wound in her lower abdomen, likely shrapnel from the Allied bombing raid that had struck their convoy a week earlier. Infection had set in. The wound had reopened during transport. Trude watched, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. An American doctor, kneeling in mud, working frantically to save a German woman's life. This wasn't supposed to happen. Captain Holloway looked up at Trude, his tired eyes meeting hers. He pointed to the red cross on his armband. "We help," he said slowly, carefully. "Understand? Helfen. We help her." Within 3 minutes, Anneliese was on a stretcher, being carried toward an ambulance that had roared into the yard. The back doors stood open, revealing a clean interior, real medical equipment, oxygen tanks, supplies arranged on metal shelves. Nothing like the makeshift aid stations the German women had seen during the war, where wounded soldiers lay on straw with barely enough bandages to go around. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, siren wailing, Elfriede Lindemann, the former head nurse who had seen more battlefield injuries than she could count, spoke for the first time. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence that had fallen over the group, everyone heard. "They're saving her. The Americans are saving her." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of the universe as they understood it. And it was only the beginning. Who were these women? 3 months earlier, they had been soldiers of a different kind. Not warriors with rifles, but the machinery behind the Wehrmacht, the typists, radio operators, telephone girls, and nurses who kept the German war machine running. Anneliese Voss had joined the Nachrichtenhelferinnen in 1942. She was 21 then, fresh from university in Cologne, fluent in French and some English. The recruiter had promised her meaningful work. "Help your nation in its hour of need," he had said. So she learned to operate radio equipment, decode messages, relay orders across static-filled channels. She believed she was serving something greater than herself. Trude Fassbinder had no choice. At 17, she received her conscription notice. Report to the Stabshelferin training center in Munich. Learn to type 60 words per minute. File reports. Answer telephones. She had wanted to be a teacher. Instead, she became a clerk in a Wehrmacht supply office in Belgium, counting ammunition crates and typing casualty lists. Elfriede Lindemann had volunteered in 1940, when Germany still seemed unstoppable. She was a trained nurse, and wounded soldiers needed care. For 5 years, she worked in field hospitals, first in France, then Poland, then the nightmare that was the Eastern Front. She had held boys as they died, whispering lies about how their wounds weren't fatal. She knew exactly what war was. By April 1945, they all knew the Reich was finished. The Americans had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were in Berlin. The infrastructure collapsed around them. Supply lines broke. Communication networks went dead. Orders came less frequently, then stopped altogether. They were captured on April 18th during the chaotic American advance through northern France. Their unit, a signals company attached to a Wehrmacht garrison, had been retreating eastward when American armored columns cut them off. The male soldiers surrendered immediately. The officers fled. The women were left standing in a farmyard with their hands up, terrified. An American lieutenant had walked through their ranks, young and sunburned, shouting something in English nobody understood. Eventually a German-speaking sergeant translated, "You're prisoners of war. You'll be processed and transported to a holding facility. Follow orders and you won't be harmed. You won't be harmed." The words meant nothing. They had been told what capture meant. During training, the instructors had been explicit. If you are captured by the Bolsheviks, They will rape you and kill you. If you are captured by the Americans, they will do the same. They simply hide it better. The Americans are hypocrites. They speak of civilization while committing atrocities. Better to die fighting than surrender. The propaganda had filled every corner of their world. Newsreels showed American soldiers looting churches. Radio broadcasts described torture camps where prisoners were starved and beaten. One particularly vivid poster, plastered across barracks walls, showed a brutish American GI towering over a terrified German woman, the caption reading, "This is what surrender looks like." So when the trucks came to transport them westward, the women prepared for death. The journey took 8 days. They traveled in covered military trucks, 43 women packed together on wooden benches. The Americans gave them water twice daily and hard biscuits that tasted like sawdust but were more food than some had seen in weeks. They stopped at night in guarded compounds. No one touched them. No one threatened them. This only deepened their fear. The cruelty would come later, they told themselves. The Americans were waiting until they reached the main camp. Then the real horror would begin. During the journey, they whispered in the darkness. Waltraud Kirchner, whose husband had died at Kursk, insisted they should resist. If they try to dishonor us, we fight. We die with dignity. She still believed every word the Frere had spoken. Germany was righteous. The enemy was evil. Defeat was temporary. Sieglinde Bachmann wasn't sure what to believe anymore. She had operated telephone switchboards in Frankfurt, connecting calls between officers who spoke of wonder weapons that never came and victories that turned into retreats. She had heard things she wasn't supposed to hear. The gap between official truth and reality had grown too wide to ignore. Elfriede said little. She had seen too much death to waste energy on speculation. Whatever came next would come. Rage wouldn't stop it. Faith wouldn't prevent it. She simply sat with her hands folded, watching the younger women wrestle with their fear. Trude prayed silently, clutching a small wooden cross her mother had given her. She was 19 years old. She had never kissed a boy, never lived alone, never made a real choice about her own life. Now, she was a prisoner, traveling toward an unknown fate in the hands of an enemy she had been taught to fear more than death itself. Then, Anneliese had collapsed in the mud, and everything they believed began to crack. The ambulance that took her away wasn't a trick. The medics who cut away her dress weren't monsters. The doctor who knelt in the mud wasn't pretending. They were trying to save her life. Why? The question hung over the remaining 42 women as American soldiers led them toward the processing tents. If the enemy was truly evil, why save one bleeding German woman? If Americans were the savages they had been warned about, why were there medical personnel instead of executioners? One answer was possible. Everything they had been told was a lie. But if that was true, what else had been lies? The question was too dangerous to speak aloud. But as they walked through the mud toward the tents, passing American soldiers who looked bored, not bloodthirsty, every woman felt it growing in her chest. Doubt. Small and terrible, and impossible to ignore. The tent smelled like disinfectant and canvas. The 42 women stood inside, blinking in the filtered light. Signs hung from support poles in both German and English: Registrierung, registration, medizinische Untersuchung, medical examination, Versorgung, supplies. Someone had taken the time to translate. That small detail registered in minds trained to notice everything. An American woman sat behind a folding table with a typewriter. She wore a Red Cross armband and looked tired but professional. She spoke through a translator, a German-American corporal who looked almost as uncomfortable as the prisoners. Name, age, unit assignment, where you were captured. The questions were simple, clinical, not accusatory. Trude went first because she was standing closest. Her voice shook as she gave her answers. The woman typed without looking up, her fingers quick on the keys. When Trude finished, the woman glanced up briefly and nodded. Not a smile, not hostility, just acknowledgement. Next, one by one, they answered the same questions. The process took an hour. No one was struck. No one was insulted. It was simply paperwork, boring, methodical, and strangely normal. Then came the medical examinations. This was where the women expected the nightmare to begin. A female American soldier led them behind a canvas partition. Trude's hands began to shake. Waltraud whispered fiercely to the woman beside her, "Stay strong. Don't let them see fear." But when they stepped through, they found something impossible. Female nurses, 4 of them. American women in crisp uniforms with Red Cross insignias. Not male soldiers, women. The lead nurse was older, perhaps 35, with dark hair pinned back and calm eyes. She spoke through the translator in a voice that was firm, but not harsh. "We will examine each of you for injuries and illness. This is required by the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with respect. If you are injured, you will receive medical care. If you are sick, you will receive medicine. Geneva Convention." The words sounded like fantasy. "You will undress behind privacy curtains," the nurse continued. "One at a time. You will be given a robe. The examination will be conducted by female medical personnel only. Privacy curtains?" Trude was motioned forward first. A nurse led her to a section divided by white sheets hanging from a metal frame. The nurse handed her a cotton robe and then, impossibly, turned her back, gave her privacy. Trude stood frozen, holding the robe, unable to process what was happening. For 2 years she had lived in crowded barracks where privacy didn't exist. She had changed clothes in rooms packed with 50 other women. She had used latrines with no doors. Privacy was a luxury from a previous life. Now, an American nurse was offering it to a German prisoner. Slowly, Trude removed her filthy uniform. The nurse kept her back turned until Trude whispered, "Fertig, ready." The examination was thorough, but gentle. The nurse checked her eyes, ears, throat, listened to her heart and lungs with a stethoscope, asked questions through the translator about pain, injuries, illness. When she found lice in Trude's hair, inevitable after weeks without proper washing, she didn't recoil in disgust. She simply made a note on a chart. "Delousing treatment will be provided after your shower," the translator explained. "Standard procedure for all incoming personnel. You'll also receive clean clothing." Shower? One by one, the others went through the same process. Some emerged from the examinations with bandages on wounds they had been hiding. Others received medications for infections. Elfriede, with her nurse's training, watched the American procedures with professional attention. She recognized the protocols, proper hygiene, organized record-keeping, genuine medical care. This wasn't theater. This was real medicine. When it was Elfriede's turn, the examining nurse was Lieutenant Lorraine Cobb, older, perhaps 40, with grey streaking her brown hair. She worked quickly and competently. At the end, she did something unexpected. She placed a hand on Elfriede's shoulder and spoke. The translator relayed, "You're going to be fine. All of you. We'll take care of you." Elfriede's throat tightened. She managed a stiff nod. The nurse smiled briefly before moving to the next patient. After medical checks came the part they had dreaded most. They were led to another building, wooden, long, with steam rising from vents. A shower facility. This was it, they thought. This was where the humiliation would happen. Mass showers. No privacy. Guards watching. But inside, they found individual stalls. 12 of them, each separated by canvas curtains. Hooks on the walls held thick white towels. On wooden benches sat stacks of clean clothing, simple cotton shirts, trousers, underwear, socks, and soap. Real soap. Bars of white soap that smelled faintly of lavender stacked beside each clothing pile like small miracles. Siglindi picked one up and turned it over in her hands. She hadn't seen real soap in over a year. The Reich had been using substitute soap made from clay and chemicals that stripped skin raw. This was smooth, gentle, and smelled like something from before the war. A Red Cross volunteer demonstrated the showers through the translator. Hot water was available. They could take as much time as they needed. No one would rush them. No one would watch. Trude entered a stall first, pulled the curtain closed, and stood in the small, private space, trembling. Then she turned the knob. Hot water poured over her. She gasped, then began to cry. She couldn't help it. The water was perfect, hot and clean and endless. She picked up the soap and worked it between her hands. The scent of lavender filled the small space. For the first time in months, she felt almost human. Around her, in other stalls, similar moments unfolded. Women wept under the spray. Others laughed in disbelief. Waltraud stood under the water in silence, her face unreadable, her ideology cracking under the simple weight of hot water and soap. When they emerged, clean, dressed in fresh clothes, hair wet and smelling of shampoo, they barely recognized each other. Elfriede stood before a small mirror mounted on the wall. She had expected to see a broken woman. Instead, she saw someone who looked merely tired. Someone who might recover. The soap sat in her hand, a small white rectangle that had somehow become a symbol of something larger. Mercy, humanity, the possibility that everything they had been taught was wrong. The mess hall contradiction. That evening, they were led to dinner. The building was large, plain, and functional. Through the open doors, the women could hear voices, American soldiers talking, laughing, the clatter of trays and silverware. The smell that rolled out was overwhelming. Meat. Cooking meat. Real meat. Trude stopped walking. Her stomach contracted so violently she had to press her hand against it. She hadn't smelled roasting meat in over a year. In Germany, meat rations had dropped to 250 grams per week in 1944. By early 1945, there was often no meat at all. Just watery soup, black bread, and potatoes when they were lucky. "Keep moving," the guard said. Not harsh, just directive. They entered the mess hall. It was enormous. Rows of long tables filled with American soldiers eating and talking. Some glanced at the German women. Most didn't. There was no special segregation, no area marked for prisoners. They were simply directed to a serving line where food was being distributed. Sieglinde went first, holding her metal tray with both hands. A server, an American sergeant with a stained apron, placed food on her tray without comment. Rice. White rice, fluffy and steaming. Not the brown, broken grains mixed with sawdust they had eaten during the war. Vegetables, green beans and carrots, actually colored, actually recognizable. Meat, a thick slice of something that looked like pork, with gravy. Bread, white bread, soft and fresh, still warm. Butter, real butter in a small paper cup. Milk, a full glass of white milk, and an orange. Sieglinde stared at the orange as if it were a hallucination. Fresh fruit had disappeared from Germany in 1943. Oranges were luxuries she remembered from childhood, Christmas treats, special occasions. Now an American mess sergeant had just placed one on her tray like it was nothing. She moved to a table in a daze. The other women followed, each receiving the same impossible portions. They sat together at the end of a long table, staring at their trays. No one ate. Waltraud spoke first, her voice low and bitter. "It's a trick. They're showing us abundance to break our spirits. Or, it's poisoned." But even as she said it, her eyes were locked on the meat. Elfriede picked up her fork. As a nurse, she had learned to be practical. Starving herself to prove a point was idiocy. She cut a small piece of meat and placed it in her mouth. She chewed slowly. Her eyes closed. It was real. Properly cooked, properly seasoned. Real meat. Not the mystery tins of preserved fat they had choked down at field hospitals. Not horse meat, or worse. This was pork, tender and rich, and her body responded to it with an intensity that shocked her. A single tear rolled down her cheek. That was all the permission the others needed. They began to eat, slowly at first, then faster, as their bodies remembered what real food meant. Some cried while eating, others ate in focused silence. Trude ate 3 bites of rice before she had to stop, her shrunken stomach unable to handle more. She sat breathing heavily, staring at the half-full tray, overwhelmed. The bread was the hardest thing to accept. Sieglinde held the slice in both hands, feeling its softness. In Berlin, bread rations had been cut to 7,500 grams per week in 1945, and that was black bread, dense and often moldy. This was white bread, soft, fresh, the kind of bread that hadn't existed in Germany since before the war. She took a bite and nearly sobbed at the taste. Across the table, another woman whispered in German, "How can they have so much?" We were told America was collapsing, that their economy was broken, that they were desperate and weak. But this, she gestured at her tray, at the half-eaten meal that was more food than she had seen in weeks. This isn't weakness. This is power. The observation settled over the table like a weight. It was true. Everything they had been told about America, that it was decadent, failing, on the verge of collapse, was being dismantled with every bite. The propaganda had promised them that Germany's discipline and sacrifice would overcome American softness. But Germany was starving in ruins while America had so much food it could feed enemy prisoners like this. The orange became a symbol. Trude held hers in both hands, unable to peel it. The color alone was almost painful to look at. Bright, vivid orange, in a world that had been grey for so long. She brought it to her nose and inhaled. The citrus scent exploded in her senses. Finally, she peeled it. Juice ran over her fingers. She separated one segment and placed it in her mouth. The sweetness was almost unbearable. After years of bland food, the intensity of flavor was shocking. Juice ran down her chin. She didn't care. She ate slowly, making each segment last, while tears streamed down her face. An American soldier at a nearby table noticed. He was young, maybe 20, with red hair and freckles. He caught Trude's eye and gave a small, awkward nod. Not mocking, not cruel, just acknowledgement. She looked away, ashamed of her tears, ashamed of her hunger, ashamed that the enemy had given her an orange and she had devoured it with gratitude. That night, back in their assigned barracks, the women lay in real beds with real mattresses and blankets. Each woman had her own bunk. Privacy curtains could be hung for those who wanted them. Waltraud spoke into the darkness, her voice hard. They're trying to make us forget. They feed us so we'll feel grateful. So we'll betray everything we believed. No one answered immediately. Then Elfried's voice came, quiet but clear. Or perhaps they're just following their own rules. The Geneva Convention requires proper food for prisoners. Maybe this isn't strategy. Maybe this is simply what they do. Even for enemies? Especially for enemies. That's what separates civilization from barbarism. The words hung in the dark barracks. Outside, the camp was quiet, except for distant voices and the sound of trucks moving supplies. 42 German women lay in clean beds, their stomachs fuller than they had been in months, their minds wrestling with a truth that refused to fit into the framework they had carried across France. The enemy had shown them mercy, and that mercy was harder to bear than cruelty would have been, because cruelty they understood. Mercy required them to see their captors as human, and once you saw the enemy as human, everything became complicated. The routine began the next morning. A schedule was posted on the barracks wall, printed in both German and English. It was regimented, but not cruel. It was simply order. The kind of structure military life had always followed. Work assignments were light. Some women were sent to the kitchen to help prepare meals. Others worked in the laundry, washing linens and uniforms. A few, including Elfried with her nursing background, were asked to assist in the camp infirmary. But what shocked them most wasn't the work. It was the payment. On the third day, each woman received an envelope containing camp scrip, paper money that could be spent only in the camp canteen. The amounts were small, roughly $2 per week, but the principle was staggering. They were being paid for their labor. Sieglinde stared at the bills in her hand as if they might vanish. This makes no sense. We're prisoners. Why would they pay us? The translator, Corporal Floyd Jernigan, explained through the wire fence. Geneva Convention, Article 62. Prisoners of war shall be paid for their work. It's the law. The law. As if law still meant something. As if rules applied even to enemies. The canteen was another revelation. A small building where prisoners could buy cigarettes, writing paper, stamps, soap, chocolate, even magazines. The prices were low, affordable with their wages. On her fourth day, Sieglinde bought a chocolate bar. She spent 50 cents, half her first week's earnings, on something frivolous, something sweet. She ate it slowly in the barracks that evening, letting each piece melt on her tongue, marveling at the taste of real chocolate after years of nothing. Trude used her money to buy writing paper and a stamp. Letters were allowed, though censored. She wrote to her mother in careful script. I am alive. I am in France, in an American camp. I am being treated according to international law. Please do not worry. I hope you are safe. I do not know when I will return, but I am well. She didn't mention the soap, the hot showers, the chocolate, the orange. Those truths were too complicated for a censored letter. How could she explain that she was living better as a prisoner than her mother likely was as a free woman in the ruins of Germany? The library was Trude's discovery. It was a small room in one of the administrative buildings, lined with shelves holding books in several languages. A sign on the door read, Bibliothek/Library, open 1400-1700 daily. The librarian was Mrs. Opal Hennessy, a Red Cross volunteer in her 50s with grey hair and kind eyes. She sat behind a desk stamping cards, organising returns. Trude entered nervously, uncertain if prisoners were truly allowed. Mrs. Hennessy looked up and smiled. Not a forced smile, a genuine one. Come in, dear. Are you looking for something to read? Trude didn't understand the English words, but the gesture was clear. Mrs. Hennessy stood and began pulling books from shelves, English primers, German novels, picture magazines. Through Corporal Jernigan, who happened to be nearby, Trude asked a question that had been weighing on her. Why would you help us? We were your enemy. The translator hesitated before conveying it. Mrs. Hennessy's expression softened. She answered slowly so the translation would be clear. My son died in North Africa in 1943. He was 22 years old. She paused, her hands resting on a stack of books. Hating you won't bring him back. But maybe teaching you to read English, maybe helping you learn, maybe that builds something better. Maybe that's what he would have wanted. Trude stood silent, the books heavy in her arms. The idea that a woman who had lost her son could choose grace over revenge violated everything she understood about the world. 2 weeks after their arrival, Annalise returned from the hospital. The women gathered around her in the barracks, touching her arms to confirm she was real. She looked transformed, colour in her cheeks, weight returning, the wound properly healed with clean white bandages. They gave me penicillin, Annalise said, sitting on her bunk. Real penicillin, not the substitute drugs we used in the field. They operated, cleaned the infection, stitched me properly. The doctors explained everything through a translator. They asked my permission before each procedure. She placed her hand over the healing wound. I thought I was going to die. I wanted to die because I thought death was better than what the Americans would do. But they saved my life. They used their medicine, their skills, their resources on an enemy. I still don't understand why. The question hung in the air. No one had an answer. Small kindnesses accumulated like snow. Corporal Chester Kowalski, a young guard from Chicago, tried to learn German phrases. His pronunciation was terrible. Guten Morgen came out as Guten Morgen, but the women appreciated the effort. One morning, Trude tripped on loose boards in the pathway and scraped her knee badly. Before she could stand, Kowalski was there, helping her up, radioing for medical help. He looked genuinely worried. You okay? He asked in broken German. Hurt bad? Small hurt, Trude answered in her limited English. He smiled, relieved. Good. Small better than big. It was a tiny exchange, almost meaningless, but it represented something larger, basic human connection across enemy lines. At night, the women talked in whispers. I believed in the Frere. One woman confessed in the darkness. I believed we were righteous, that we were saving Europe from decadence. But if we were right, why are we the ones starving in ruins? Why does the enemy have so much they can give oranges to prisoners? Waltraud still resisted. They're trying to break us, make us forget our loyalty. But her voice lacked conviction now. Even she had accepted the food, used the soap, slept in the clean bed. Elfried spoke carefully. I think we were lied to. Not just by the government, but by ourselves. We wanted to believe Germany was special, destined for greatness. But the truth is simpler. We were people caught in a war started by leaders who valued power over humanity. Letters began arriving from Germany. The news was devastating. Cities in ruins, starvation widespread, millions homeless. The contrast between their treatment and their families' suffering created crushing guilt. Sieglinde received a letter from her sister. We have bread twice a week, if we're lucky. Mother is sick. There is no medicine, but we survive. Stay strong. She read it in the barracks and wept. That evening, she ate her dinner in the mess hall while her family starved. The injustice was unbearable. Yet refusing food wouldn't feed her sister. Dying wouldn't save her mother. So she ate and hated herself, bowed deeply. The colonel returned it, less practiced, but sincere. In that moment, the distance between prisoner and captor disappeared. They were simply two people acknowledging shared humanity. The night before departure, the women held a final gathering. Elfried stood and spoke to the group. We survived something impossible. We survived not just the war, but the collision of everything we believed with reality. Some of us changed completely. Some changed a little. Some are still struggling. But we've all been marked by this. We can't pretend it didn't happen, she paused, her voice strengthening. Germany will be different too. Devastated, yes. Defeated, yes. But also rebuilding. Maybe we can be part of that. Maybe what we learned here, about democracy, about rights, about mercy, maybe those lessons are what Germany needs now. The ship home was American, clean and well-maintained. The women travelled in cabins, not cargo holds. They ate regular meals, slept in real bunks. Even in departure, the standards remained. Trude stood on deck as the French coast disappeared behind them. She felt as if she were leaving more than a place. She was leaving a version of herself, the girl who had believed the propaganda, who saw the world simply, who never questioned. That girl had died somewhere between the dock and the hospital, between fear and understanding. Germany in 1946 was unrecognizable. When their ship docked in Hamburg, Trude saw a landscape of rubble. Cities that once buzzed with life were fields of destruction. People moved like ghosts, thin, hollow-eyed, wearing whatever they could find. Children begged. Old women sold possessions for bread. Trude found her mother living in a shelter built from scavenged wood. When they embraced, Trude felt her mother's bones through thin clothing. The guilt crashed over her. She was healthy, carrying soap and chocolate as gifts. Her mother was starving, but her mother didn't accuse. She simply held her daughter and wept with relief. Later, when Trude tried to explain the camp, her mother listened without judgment. "You survived," she said finally. "That's what matters. Now you can help us rebuild." Over the following years, that's exactly what they did. Trude used her English to work with American occupation forces, translating documents, building bridges between occupiers and occupied. She saw the same contradiction. The nation that had bombed Germany now helped rebuild schools and hospitals. Anneliese became a teacher, educating German students about international law and human rights. Elfriede returned to nursing, working in a hospital with American military doctors, learning new techniques, sharing knowledge. Sieglinde married, had children, and told them stories about the war, not the propaganda version, but the truth. The soap that smelled like lavender, the orange she tasted, the American nurse who held a patient's hand, the colonel who spoke of mercy as choice. "What did it teach you?" her daughter asked years later. Sieglinde thought carefully. "It taught me that people are more complicated than we want them to be, that enemies can show kindness, that nations can be brutal and merciful both, for being grateful." The cracks in their ideology widened daily. Each small mercy, each act of basic decency, each moment of unexpected humanity chipped away at the certainty they had carried. The Reich had taught them that Americans were monsters. But monsters didn't pay prisoners' wages. Monsters didn't provide libraries. Monsters didn't ask permission before surgery. Slowly, painfully, the women began to understand. Everything they had believed was built on lies, and now they had to decide what to build in its place. Winter came to Camp Lucky Strike, bringing cold rain and grey skies. In December 1945, the announcement arrived. Repatriation would begin in January. Ships would take them home to Germany. The women should prepare to leave within weeks. The news should have brought joy. Instead, it brought dread. Trude lay in her bunk that night, listening to rain drum on the roof, and realized she was afraid to go home. Not afraid of the journey, but afraid of what she would find. Afraid of her mother's eyes looking at her healthy face. Afraid of neighbors asking what captivity had been like. Afraid to admit she had lived better as a prisoner than they had lived free. More than that, she was afraid of losing something she had gained here. A certain clarity. In this camp, stripped of propaganda, she had seen people at their most basic, capable of cruelty and kindness both. Not demons, not angels, just humans. Going home might mean returning to the old lies, the old certainties, the old ways of seeing the world in simple terms. She wasn't sure she could do that anymore. Anneliese's transformation was most visible. The woman who had collapsed bleeding in the mud was gone. In her place was someone stronger, clearer, more thoughtful. The scar on her abdomen would always remind her how close she had come to death and how American medicine had saved her. One afternoon, Anneliese requested a meeting with the camp commander, Colonel Harlan Presley. With Elfriede and Trude accompanying her, she entered his office. Colonel Presley was a quiet man in his 50s with tired eyes. He invited them to sit and asked what they needed. Anneliese spoke in careful English, words she had been practicing for weeks. "Colonel, I want to thank you. When I collapsed, I believed I was dying. I believed Americans would let me die or kill me. I was wrong. You saved my life. You gave me medicine, surgery, care. You treated me like a human being when I expected to be treated like an animal. I don't understand why, but I am grateful." She paused, gathering herself. "We were taught to hate you. We were taught you were evil. But you showed us kindness when you could have shown cruelty. You gave us dignity when you could have taken it. You changed how I see the world. That is a gift I didn't expect and don't deserve, but I will carry it for the rest of my life." The colonel was quiet. Then he spoke gently. "Miss Voss, we did what any civilized nation should do. We followed the Geneva Convention because it represents the best of human behavior during the worst times. War is terrible, but it doesn't have to destroy our humanity. I'm glad you recovered, and I hope when you return to Germany, you'll remember even enemies can choose mercy." Anneliese, the world doesn't fit simple stories. It taught me that surviving isn't just staying alive, it's staying human. And mercy is harder to carry than hatred, but it's the only thing that lasts. They had entered captivity as believers in the Reich. They left as students of a different truth, that humanity persists even in war's darkest hours, and that choice matters more than ideology. The story of these 43 German women is one thread in a larger tapestry. Thousands of Axis prisoners experienced similar awakenings in Allied camps during World War II. Each story matters because each represents a human being confronting the gap between propaganda and reality, between hatred and understanding. As Annalise told her grandchildren before she died in 2001, the Americans didn't break us with cruelty, they broke us with kindness. And that breaking hurt more than torture could have, because it forced us to see them as human. Once you see your enemy as human, you can never hate the same way again. That's the lesson. That's why the soap mattered more than the bombs. The greatest weapon wasn't military might. It was the choice to treat enemies with dignity. That choice echoed across generations, proving that even in war, mercy can be more powerful than vengeance. This is why these stories must be told. They remind us that humanity is always a choice, and that choice defines us more than any victory or defeat ever could.